Well, it's time for world politics, and of course, there's all kinds of things that are happening on the political front, and we'll be definitely getting to some of those and seeing what people got to say about them. And all along those lines, I've got Rick Rosner and Adam Lamparello with me, and I was glad that I've got Adam with me on this particular day and everything, because while we may not agree on all things, we do have some interesting conversations, some that we agree on, some that we don't agree on. But isn't that what friends do all the time and all in that space? But I did see, and this is why I was glad that Adam was here. And definitely, I'm sure Rick will have some thoughts about this as well as Nick and anybody else that may be coming in and all along those lines. But the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments Thursday, and I know that Nick always talks about the fact that he can practice in front of the Supreme Court as he has those kind of privileges. And I think Adam may have even practiced in front of the Supreme Court as well, but I'll ask him when he gets here. But what's going on is whether former President Donald Trump can be criminally prosecuted over his efforts to overturn the 2020 election loss. And the justices apparently grappled with the monumental question of if, and if so, to what extent former presidents enjoy immunity for conduct alleged to have involved official acts during their time in office. Trump claims absolute protection for what he claims were official acts, though he denies all wrongdoing. The High Court apparently is divided over this, but most of the conservative-leaning justices in the majority seem open to some version of it, while still excluding a president's private conduct. The High Court ruling will determine if Trump stands trial before the November election on 4 charges brought by special counsel Jack Smith, including conspiracy to defraud the United States. A decision is expected by June, but I was going to bring in one of our legal experts, because we've always got some good legal experts here on the network, and also bring in Rick Rosner, and we'll see who else is here. But like I said, I was glad that Adam was here. I don't know if Adam has ever practiced before the Supreme Court. I know that Nick has, and all along those lines, but this does become a question, because then it opens up a can of worms, as the old saying goes, and everything, because if President Trump gets this immunity, does that mean that other presidents will have immunity? And can there be back immunity? Like if there were some people that felt that there were acts done in the past that were not that favorable by past presidents. I'm thinking of like Nixon and Watergate. I'm thinking of even some of the things that Kennedy may have been done that his family might claim this immunity should the case continue, if there should be any further causes from the past that would go on in that space. And we've also got Sasha, so we may get into Russia as well. But what is your take on the Supreme Court possibly leaning toward allowing immunity for former President Trump?
Well, thank you, Mark. First, yes, I'm a member of the Supreme Court Bar, and I filed over 10 amicus briefs in cases before the Supreme Court. So I do have some experience with the Supreme Court. And I will say this. The question is not whether the president has no immunity or whether the president has absolute immunity. The court's going to come down somewhere in the middle and is going to say that the president has some immunity for official acts conducted while in office, but probably not immunity for acts that constitute personal conduct for personal benefit. Now, how they're going to formulate that test is anybody's guess. But let's think about this. Should George W. Bush have immunity for taking us into a war in Iraq based on false pretenses? Should Barack Obama have immunity for targeting people through the IRS? You can name many, many examples of improprieties committed by presidents in the function of their official duties. The question is, should they have immunity for that? My answer would be yes. Otherwise, the president really can't function and do so in a way to discharge properly the duties of his office. However, when that official conduct transgresses into personal conduct, then you have a different story because, for example, a president can't murder somebody or just order the assassination of a political rival. The question is going to become, where is the dividing line between official conduct falling within the duties of the office and personal conduct for a personal benefit? I think the court's going to come down somewhere in the middle and say some of Trump's conduct is immune and some is not. And I think that the court is going to say that the district court for the District of Columbia has to make the determination of which aspects of his conduct are official and which conduct is not. And I think they're going to remand it to the district court for the District of Columbia to make that determination, thereby delaying the case until after the election.
That makes a lot of sense. Before I bring in Rick and definitely Sasha as well, because I think Rick's got a question and I definitely had one as well. I know you kind of alluded to it with the IRS comment and everything, but in the past, there have been agencies that have quote unquote done the dirty work of the executive office. I know that as one that is involved and has been involved for years, and as well as having parents that were involved, particularly my dad, but definitely mom to some degree as well, in the civil rights space and everything, there was the notion of COINTELPRO, and that we got the FBI and a lot of other folks into trouble as they were doing a lot of spying on not just African-American organizations, but even some of the very liberal organizations of the 60s that might have been in the environmental space, the anti-Vietnam space, and all along those lines. So will that kind of come up in conversation as well? Because this seems to give the president the power, whereas before they were using delegate agencies, whether that was the FBI, whether that was the IRS that you just mentioned, or whether that was other delegate agencies that were also federal agencies as well. But I just wanted your take on that as I bring in Rick and Sasha.
Well, that brings up a very interesting question, because the dichotomy is not just between whether the president was acting in his official capacity or her official capacity or personal capacity. The question is, even if the president was acting in his or her official capacity, but violating the criminal law in so doing, should immunity apply? And I think the Supreme Court is going to say, in some cases, yes, and in some cases, no, and remand it to the DC Circuit to look at the indictment and make those distinctions, thereby taking some allegations and dismissing them on the basis of immunity and retaining others based on the fact that they involve personal conduct or criminal conduct in an official capacity, thus warranting no immunity, which will delay the case, but ultimately make sure that it's consistent with the rule of law and the Constitution.
People forget that we had a president who was involved in a murder cover-up. In 1997, President Gene Hackman's Secret Service agents shot a woman that he was having an affair with. And Clint Eastwood, a jewel thief, witnessed the whole thing. Well, there was a whole movie about it. I'm surprised it never comes up, because the name of the movie is Absolute Power, which, you know, I don't know if I ever.
Hold on a second, Rick. That's a fictional movie, but there are some people, and I'm going to bring it up, and some people, including some of my Democrat friends, might not be glad that I'm bringing it up. But there are some people that would argue that that actually happened in a factual time frame. Because while I am a Democrat, that's how I'm registered, and while I am also very much a fan to some degree of the person I'm going to mention, and all along those lines, there are some people that have argued that the Clintons ordered a hit on a certain federal officer, and that person was actually killed at their behest. And that is Ron Brown, the former Commerce Secretary, because that plane accident was very mysterious, and nobody ever told me how that quote unquote accident happened. And all along those lines, it made sense to me. Did it ever make sense to you, Adam, and everything? Because that was under the
Mark, it didn't make sense to me, but let's assume for the sake of argument, and I'm just saying for the sake of argument, that Ron Brown was killed at the direction of Bill Clinton. Obviously, he would never have immunity whatsoever for that, because that doesn't involve an official act. It involves a personal act for private gain. But now let's look at George W. Bush, when after 9/11, he established secret interrogation sites where he engaged in waterboarding and other interrogation tactics that many would conclude were torture. And let's look at Abu Ghraib, where we saw prisoners being humiliated, embarrassed, and degraded by U.S. troops. Now, in that situation, arguably George W. Bush, although heinous in his choices and in the effects of those choices, would have immunity. And that is the distinction the court, I believe, is trying to make, and that it will require the D.C. Circuit to make before this case proceeds.
What's your take, Sasha? Sasha, I know you've been following this case and watching it on a regular basis, even though I think you're with your daughter, if I remember correctly, from the chess show and some of the other shows. But what's your take on this particular case and this notion of?
First of all, Adam, thank you so much for your interpretation of today's hearings. I've heard today's hearings myself, and there was one example I forgot to be judged. Asked an example how difficult is to separate what's in the line of duty of what he's performing as president and what is for his personal gains. An example is actually in real life. He had, I forgot his name, a wealthy businessman who got for payment of $1 million, he got the ambassadorship, I think in Belgium at the time. And so here Trump performs his duties as a president. He appoints a person as a president, as ambassador of a foreign country. That's great. On the other hand, at the same time, as the package deal, he's taking a bribe for $1 million. How you evaluate the situation? Should be he prosecuted for that?
So my response to you would be twofold. First, every single legislator in Congress got to Congress because lobbyists and organizations supported them. For example, the National Rifle Association put many Republicans in office, and in exchange, those congressmen consistently vote against gun regulation. Now, is that a crime? Is that a bribe? Some could argue that.
You're not
But others would argue that that is just part of how the system works, particularly after the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United versus FEC. Now, to your example about Trump and the $1 million, the first thing I would say is we have to see whether, and in fact, what you say is true and can be proven in a court of law. The second thing would be whether that was considered part and parcel of his official duties and custom and practice based on history and tradition within the Oval Office. I don't have the answers to that question. So you raise a good inquiry, but the answer can't be resolved without further exploring the issue and having appropriate evidence to do so.
Fair enough.
So it would be hard to find a president who hasn't been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people.
That's my point.
George W. Bush lies us into Iraq, 500,000 Iraqis killed. Obama pulls us out maybe prematurely, another 500,000, takes out Gaddafi, Libya, failed state, terrible since then. Trump politicizes COVID. And so at least 300,000 unnecessary COVID deaths. Nobody, I mean, I've seen it on Twitter, but nobody reasonably suggests like taking Trump to court over those unnecessary deaths.
Well, let me ask you this. Should John F. Kennedy have immunity for having sex with young women in the Oval Office repeatedly, day after day during his tenure? Should LBJ have immunity for increasing the troops in Vietnam, which led to the deaths of thousands of Americans? Should Richard Nixon have immunity for what he did with Watergate? Should George W. Bush have immunity for what he did with those secret interrogations that led to torture and leading us into a war that was based on false pretenses? The problem with the immunity argument in Trump's case is that it proves too much and it proves too little at the same time. If you say there's no immunity, then it sweeps all those presidents within the ambit of criminality. If you say there's absolute immunity, it excludes those presidents who did engage in criminal conduct, even if it was within their official duties. So where you draw that line is critical, and I think the Supreme Court is going to tell the district court to do that first before they can proceed.
But all the presidents you mentioned, Kennedy like banging a zillion women, and he even had a bang room in the White House basement, where he'd take his ladies, and that's not illegal to bang everybody.
It may not be illegal, but is that within the conduct of his official duties?
No, it's for fun.
So should he have immunity if someone claims that they were sexually harassed? What if Monica Lewinsky said that Bill Clinton sexually harassed her? How do you determine whether it's within official duties, private conduct, and even if so, under what circumstances you should prosecute? Those are really difficult questions, and I think we need to resolve them before we go full speed ahead with the prosecution of Trump.
Right, I
And
mean,
Sasha had a question for you as well.
getting with Lewinsky is not shouldn't have immunity. That's wanting to have sex.
Right, but should you have immunity for bringing us into a war under false pretenses? Should you have immunity for breaking international treaties? Should you have immunity for lying to the American public and saying, read my lips, no new taxes, and then having the biggest tax increase in 1990 under George H.W. Bush? My point is, you have to be very careful about how you define immunity, because it can sweep both too broadly and it can also be too limited. And we have to resolve these questions as a constitutional matter before we start convicting presidents. Otherwise, we're going to set a precedent that leads to unforeseeable, and I would argue foreseeable harm.
Well, the question that everybody asks, including they asked it in court, I think, again today, is should a president who consider under his official duties, like if they didn't use this example, but it's the example everybody uses, if Biden thinks Trump is dangerous to the nation as president, should he have the right to have Trump assassinated?
The answer to that would be no, because that's not within the conduct of his official duties, and it's also a crime. But how about this question? When LBJ was running for president, and he put out a commercial, I don't know if you remember, with the little girl holding a flower and then a nuclear bomb exploding, essentially scaring the American public into believing that nuclear war was on the horizon. That was false. That was misleading. Should LBJ be charged with fraud? Because right now in New York City, we have Donald Trump being charged with fraud based on business records in connection with an affair with a porn star. I think this is the problem that it highlights. You have to have an appropriate legal and constitutional standard before you start charging presidents, or the unintended and, in fact, the intended consequences are going to affect both parties and ultimately democracy and the rule of law.
Adam, quick question. So how come this trial in New York is continuous while Supreme Court is just about to make a decision? Maybe soon, maybe not so soon, but still, what makes sense to continue the New York trial?
I don't think it makes sense to continue the trial. I don't think it made sense to ever bring this case against Trump. He's a former president. This involves a non-disclosure agreement in connection with an affair that he had with with a porn star. Okay. He entered into that non-disclosure agreement to protect his reputation, his business, and obviously his marriage, and probably the embarrassment to his marriage and children. There's nothing illegal about this. No crime was committed here.
What is illegal then?
Then what would be illegal? It would be illegal if Trump engaged in this conduct for the purpose of influencing the 2016 election.
That remains to be proven in court. It's not proven yet.
But it would have to be proven that it was solely to influence the 2016 election. And I would argue that it's obvious that he did it for other reasons, namely his business, his family, his wife, and his own personal reputation. And never before has a president been charged criminally in a court of law for conduct like this. If you're going to charge a former president of the United States, it should be for something far more egregious. I mean, Richard Nixon was pardoned by Gerald Ford. This conduct is really a misdemeanor in New York City, and the statute of limitations has even passed on it. It's ridiculous. It's politically motivated. It's selective prosecution, and it's wrong.
What's the difference between Nixon and Trump? Nixon has not puked in public. He did not fart.
Who farted? You farted.
The difference between Nixon and Trump is that what Nixon did is far more egregious, for which he received a pardon, to preserve democracy, to preserve people's faith in the system, and to get the people beyond this. What Alvin Bragg is doing is political. He's got a Manhattan jury. He's got a liberal judge, just like E. Jean Carroll did. It degrades and denigrates the rule of law. It demeans our faith in the legal system. And it really is a shameful day for American democracy, the rule of law, and our belief that politics and law should be impartial and objective.
Yeah, Rick, you had a question?
A couple comments and then a question. If he was doing this to protect his family from embarrassment, it's pretty weird that nobody from Trump's family is with him in court. and I've been following E. Jean Carroll for 30 years. She's been a relationship columnist for one of the women's magazines.
Yes, she's made some very controversial statements against women.
But she's a writer and a humor writer, basically. So yeah, she's going to say outrageous stuff.
She's about as credible as Michael Cohen.
I disagree.
You disagree?
Well, wait, no, I don't know. I find Cohen credible about something. But anyway, my question is, all right, so
I'm sorry.
That people, libs mostly, argue about Merrick Garland, saying, why is he taking so long? Like, because you said that, this stuff going on while the election is going on. People on Twitter like to say, well, if Merrick Garland had just moved earlier on Trump and prosecution and didn't wait for a special prosecutor, some of these issues could have been resolved like a year ago, before we were in the middle of an election. What do you have to say about Merrick Garland and the speed with which these things happen?
I don't agree with a lot of what Merrick Garland does, but I agree wholeheartedly with him here for two reasons. First, the Department of Justice has an internal memorandum that says you shall not engage in any prosecutions that may or could influence an election. Number two, Merrick Garland realized, as did the DOJ and the Southern District of New York, that the evidence was simply not there to charge Trump with a crime, because Trump did not commit a crime. What Alvin Bragg did under political pressure was to manufacture a crime after first declining himself to even prosecute, even after campaigning to get Trump, which is disgraceful in a democracy where the rule of law should be applied to everybody. What Bragg is doing is purely political. It's designed to stop Trump from returning to the White House, and it's weaponizing the rule of law for political purposes. And if you want to talk about fascism and the end of democracy, you need look no further than the courthouse in New York City.
Yeah, I got another Supreme Court question for you, Adam. But before I get to that, I did see, and this is just a slight pivot before I get to the Supreme Court again, that NDAs are coming up in the news again because apparently, oddly, because I was reading it in a news report that I was looking at earlier this afternoon, because even though OJ passed away now a couple of weeks ago, and all along those lines, there are now sports bet odds as to whether there will be damning evidence found against him, whether people will have to honor the non-disclosure agreements that they put on, and how much of that Bronco is going to go for. I think the last figure I heard was like 1.5 million or something like that and everything. So apparently this is a new sport that is going on in the sports betting field, that they are betting on what is going to happen with O.J. Simpson and some of the legal laws that happened even in those NDAs that he had. But my question for you around the Supreme Court, because there's another argument that's going on in the Supreme Court, Adam, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around this, because we talked about it on both World Edition and other shows, is the notion, and you kind of alluded to it, of women's rights and even what can be done with the Dobbs decision. Because apparently Idaho is in front of the Supreme Court, and some people are very upset because they apparently have one of the most restrictive abortion bans in the country. They say that they prohibit abortions at all stages of at any stage of gestation, with no exception for rape or incest, and apparently it allows the doctors to perform abortions in case where the life, but not merely the health of the pregnant woman, is at risk. So they have apparently some very serious rules as to what can be done in that space in the state of Idaho. And the Supreme Court has taken this on because the federal government says that Idaho's ban on health-preserving emergency abortion conflicts with a federal statute known as the Emergency Medical Treatment Act, or EMTALA. So that 1986 law requires that all emergency rooms located in a hospital to receive Medicare funding, that is basically all of them, are required to issue stabilizing care to patients facing medical emergencies. So I just wanted your notion on this idea, because apparently this is one of the most restrictive rules out there. And we know that there are different states that have different rules after Dobbs was put out there. But I don't know if you've been following this case, Adam, and if you have any thoughts around this particular case that's in front of the Supreme Court as well.
I sure do. I don't agree with the Idaho law at all, but I do want to put into context abortion jurisprudence. Mm-hmm. Roe versus Wade was one of the worst decisions in the history of the United States Supreme Court's constitutional jurisprudence. Not because I'm pro-life, I'm pro-choice, but because the Supreme Court invented a right to abortion out of thin air and disregarded the Constitution's words and original meaning and tradition and history to create this right just because 9 unelected judges thought that that was what we should do. And when you give judges that kind of power, that is the end of democracy, because you're basically telling 9 unelected life tenure judges, we can do whatever we want based on whatever our policy predilections are. That is a prescription for the end, not the evolution of democracy. So Roe versus Wade was based on absolutely no firm constitutional footing, and Dobbs was correct to say that the issue of abortion should be returned to the states and decided through democratic choice. Now, having said that, if it were decided through democratic choice, I would support a woman's right to choose, and I would encourage all states to do so, because women deserve that protection. It's important for their equality in our social, economic, financial society, and to make sure that people have equal protection of the law.
Rick?
So a couple things. One is that it's tough to return things to the states after 2010's red map strategy gave Republicans controls of state legislatures where they didn't have majority support. Republicans learned how to take over state legislatures in the 2010s, and they took over 3/4 of America's state houses, even though they didn't have majority support. So that kind of sucks. On the other hand, you're talking about Idaho being a terrible state for abortion. You're not as screwed in Idaho as you are in other parts of America, because I'm looking at a map of Idaho, and Boise is only about 20 miles from the Oregon state line. Mm-hmm. So you got Oregon on one side, you got Nevada to the south. Utah, similarly, maybe bad for getting an abortion, but you're bordered by a bunch of states where you can get an abortion. So you're slightly less screwed in Idaho or Utah than you would be in the southeast, in Florida or Georgia, where you have to drive across a zillion states to get an abortion.
Well, in response to that, Rick, I would say I probably agree with you. But your other point about how some Republicans control the legislature, well, I could say the same thing about New York State, where the New York State Senate absolutely controls the legislature. I could say the same thing about California. The problem is not a Republican or Democratic problem. The problem is gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court should have taken this issue up and really restricted gerrymandering, because what it does is it disenfranchises voters on both sides of the spectrum. And that's a threat to democracy, because that dilutes the power of one person, one vote. And until we solve that and address other issues affecting democracy, we're really not going to have a true democracy. Donald Trump is not the threat to democracy. The threat to democracy, in fact, is both political parties.
Hey,
I
just really quickly
agree with you about gerrymandering. It's terrible.
Yeah, ask you about the gerrymandering, because gerrymandering I know has been an issue as far back as, like, I won't say even the 60s and everything, when I was
it's named after a guy in the 18th century, Elbridge Gerry. And he designed a district that was shaped like a snake or a bird, and they called that the gerrymander, like a salamander. Right. But the Supreme Court, they were chicken shit. They punted on addressing it, one, for politics, and two, because it's mathematically complicated. How do you make elections fair for both parties in the state?
Well, there's a third-party candidate, and I'd love to hear Adam's thoughts about this. Well, there are several third-party candidates, but as I mentioned on World Edition, apparently Cornel West, who picked a Muslim lady to be his vice president, I guess that was a week or two ago, and everything, has said that both parties, meaning the Republicans and the Democrats, are corrupt, and that we are in a serious turmoil with what we have been offered with the sense of Biden for the Democrats and Trump for the Republicans. So what are our thoughts around this? Because he's not the only one that said that. I think RFK has said that, even though he doesn't have the support of his own family members. And I'm sure that Jill Stein and others that are running or that are independents in one form or another have been bringing up this point as well. So how far away are the parties, and this is for everybody on the panel, from being true representative voices of the people?
Well, I would say that they're not, and I'll make a simple analogy for everyone. Yeah. Imagine that you go into a bar and someone says to you, you can ask out any girl in this bar on a date. Alternatively, imagine if someone says, you can only ask out one of those 4 women seated at the bar and nobody else. That's exactly what American democracy is. We don't give people the right to choose the candidate that they truly want. What we do is we restrict the field to only 2 candidates and say, you have to choose between the 2. Now, if you were in that bar and someone said, you can only choose among 4 of the 200 girls here, would you think that you were free and you had liberty? Well, guess what? That's exactly what happens in American elections. And it's backed by wealthy people who funnel so much money into the political process that it gives incumbents and preordained candidates an insurmountable advantage, thereby making third-party candidates, it makes it almost impossible for them to win. So you want to listen to MSNBC and CNN and hear about the threats that Trump poses to democracy? Trump is the least threat, the smallest threat to democracy, and I would say 0 threat. The threat is all the things I've just mentioned, and unless we pick them, democracy is going to become an illusion rather than.
You're also a professor, and as a matter of fact, you got your professor outfit on today. I'm just teasing you about that and everything, but there is a number of campuses, because that's the other issue I was going to get to that I know Sasha's going to love this conversation, because it's definitely involving one of the countries that he is very passionate about. I think Rick may have some passionate views about them as well, but as I remember when I was in school in the 80s, there was a whole lot of talk around divestiture and the notion of divestiture around South Africa and all in that, because of what was going on with apartheid and companies that were supporting that. I think Coca-Cola was targeted and a couple of other companies were targeted as well. And apparently across the campuses of the United States, there are people that are calling on schools to divest from all financial support of Israel, because they are saying that divestment is usually referring to selling shares in companies doing business with any given country. And apparently this has been a long-standing goal of certain people. So now college protesters are hoping to force their university to divest, to put financial pressure on companies doing business in Israel, because they feel that Israel is doing some horrible acts in Gaza and all in that space. So they're hoping that it will put some pressure on the government of Israel by divesting. So I was just wondering, one, does divestiture ever really work? And what our thoughts are around this pressure on the campuses of not just the United States, because I think there's some pressure in some of the European theater as well to divest from companies that might be supportive of the Israel government. And does divestiture work?
It helped a little bit with South Africa, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? I don't think it's going to help in the case of Israel. Israel's got a pretty, I think, strong economy that won't be hurt by people divesting. And Netanyahu's survival depends on him not listening to anything, not his own people, not the rest of the world. He needs to keep prosecuting the war, even if it's a little bit genocidal, because once he ends the war, he's probably going to get booted out of office and possibly prosecuted.
So to answer your question, you're right. South Africa is the most prominent example of it apparently being successful. Apparently, some of the people that I was reading about gave the example of a very small nation that apparently a major oil company was backed in and everything, and that was the country of Myanmar, because apparently the energy giant Chevron ended up selling off an asset to an entity that human rights group said was even less accountable. So apparently the energy giant Chevron was part of that. So apparently that was another case where maybe it worked if people were targeting Chevron and all in that space. But what is your thoughts, either Sasha or Adam, about this notion of divestiture and whether it even works as a political tool?
Well, Mark, one thing I'll say is this. We talk a lot about January 6th. Mm-hmm. We don't talk a lot about October 7th. The Jews were relentlessly attacked by Hamas. Right. They were raped, tortured, killed, burned alive, children, women, families. What these protesters are doing on college campuses is disgusting. They have every right to march in the streets and express their views, however distasteful and offensive some might find them to be, because that contributes to the marketplace of ideas. But they have no right to go onto a college campus and camp out and express their views, because college campuses are not a public forum or public property to people who aren't students or who aren't affiliated with the university. It's disgusting. So I object to them, number one, on the substance of their views, and also on what they're doing to disrupt university life and create conflict in favor of a cause that is absolutely disgraceful.
Hey, Adam, just really
Jews
quick,
were attacked on October 7th.
No,
They had every right to
October 7th was
retaliate,
a
and Hamas
horrible
should
act,
be
and definitely
destroyed.
Hamas should be
I
destroyed.
would like to
But-
add something that there were overheard on the Columbia University grounds talk between two girls. One is asking the other one, "What are you protesting against?" And she's saying, "Well, I'm not sure. We have to find out." They don't know what they're doing there. They're being paid, and this is completely illegal. All of them have to be thrown in jails as soon as possible.
Well, Sasha, you know who you can thank for this? You can thank university professors, the almost uniformly liberal university professors at Columbia, at Cornell, at Washington and Lee, at the University of Connecticut, at the University of Florida, at the University of Iowa, at the University of Southern California, at UCLA and UC Berkeley. You can fault them for indoctrinating their students into one worldview without respecting and providing them with alternative perspectives. That is the seed upon which ignorance grows.
Hey, hold on a second. But,
I
Adam, just really,
know that you are a university professor, and
I am.
my late uncle was university professor in Drexel University in Pennsylvania. I know a little bit about life and what they are doing, university professors. Most of them are populists who are fighting for grants and who have to be popular and who mingle with students trying to increase their classroom attendance. That's all what they are. They are nobody. They are influencing the public much more than what they really are. They are trying to make a living of the grants, of the influence, and they have to be popular, so they have to share certain political agenda with their students, with their superiors, and so on and on and on. So to me, university professor is zero, nothing, zilch.
Right, so hold on.
Hold on a second, both Adam and Sasha, because I've got.
Well, I can
friends
respond to
in-
Sasha before Rick goes, and then Rick, you can have the floor. Sasha, I agree with you 100%. I am disgusted at the conduct of professors like at Columbia, over 50 of them signing a petition supporting the people with these disgusting and unlawful protests. In my classroom, I welcome liberal opinions. I welcome conservative opinions because everybody has a right to voice those opinions so that people can learn, because they can be informed and develop their own opinions. But sadly, I'm the exception, not the
But
rule.
Adam,
And
hold
the
on a
result
second.
is it
Adam,
degrades
that's
a
not-
society.
Hold on.
Hold on a second, both of you,
All right.
because I definitely
Hold
want
on.
to get to you.
Hold on. Let me say a thing. So
Yeah.
I went to university for 6 years because I was a crap student. Actually, 7. If I didn't like a class, I'd just quit going and I'd flunk, and I'm a terrible student. But I took a zillion classes. And I never heard any political stuff because I took physics, I took dance, I took art classes. You said 50 professors at Columbia signed some petition.
58.
So Columbia has 7,200 full and part-time faculty. So you're saying 50, which is 2/3 of 1%. Most of those professors at Columbia are teaching their subject. The people don't learn to protest because they sat in a class where
It was 58 professors from the law school, not
Okay.
from the university.
But most classes don't. I took English. I took all this stuff. Nobody was talking politics.
When did you take those classes?
In the 80s, basically.
It's very different now, Rick.
I still believe that nobody is arguing politics in a class on quantum mechanics or in dance class. Maybe
well, the majority of students aren't taking quantum mechanics. They're taking the humanities, sociology, psychology,
no, that's not
criminal
true.
justice,
At
philosophy,
Harvard,
history.
half the students are STEM majors.
Yes, and the other half aren't. And at most liberal arts colleges, the vast majority of people are taking colleges, majors in the humanities, and liberal arts colleges make up the majority of colleges. And I would encourage you to audit one single course at UC Berkeley, and I think you would see how different it is from the 80s. And I do miss the 80s, I must say.
Yeah, so yeah, that's when I was getting laid occasionally. Yeah.
That's a good one. Yeah.
And Rick, you probably didn't do well in school because you have an exceptionally high IQ. And
I just I'd fall asleep. I'd wake up in a puddle of drool.
Yeah, because people with very high IQs like you really see the idiocy in higher education and how simple, uncurious, and unstimulating it is.
Well,
it doesn't encourage original thought. It doesn't encourage creativity or unique thought. Why were you a writer for Jimmy Kimmel? Not because of anything you learned in a classroom, but because of your innate talents of creativity, analytical skills, timing, and also writing ability. And you're not going to get that at a university. That's why Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard. And that's a credit to you, but it's also an indictment of higher education that they can't take the brightest among us like you and make them even brighter.
What happened to me was that I liked hooking up. I wasn't great at it, but I worked in bars like 6 nights a week because that's where the women were. And like once a year, I might get lucky. And so I was working till 2 a.m.
Hope you didn't date a Virgo.
No, but Adam, just really quickly, one of the things, because I was going to mention, is I have and I know that Nick is always bringing up his relatives and everything, but I have a cousin that is very well known at Duke University. He is known because of a certain issue, and he is a proponent of that issue. Whether I agree with him 100% or not, we can get into a debate about that, and we have had debates about what I'm going to bring about and everything. But I think Sandy Darity is either my second or third cousin, but he is definitely related to me, and he was just in your area of California because he's one of the leading reparation experts and leading reparation consultants in the country. So he's a backer of reparations for the African-American population. He's a Duke University professor. I can tell you for a fact that I know that not everybody that takes Sandy's courses, because they are not all about reparations, is agreeing with him, because he has both liberal and conservative students. So, and I also know that there are different organizations that are on the campuses as well. There are the Young Republicans on Duke, there are the Young Democrats, and there are a number of speakers that come to these campuses to speak, some that people agree with and some that disagree. So just like you mentioned your students that don't agree with you and some that agree with you, I'm sure that if I brought Sandy on, and he's been on my show, he's never been on our World Edition of World Politics, he would say that there are students on his campus that don't necessarily agree with what he or his wife, Christy Mullins, who is his
Mark, it doesn't matter if he has conservative students and liberal students in his classroom. What matters is whether he encourages both conservatives and both liberals to express their views rather than imposing his own on the students.
Because no, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that he does that. He does the same thing that you say you do. He doesn't.
Well, that's really good.
That he doesn't agree with.
That's really good because most studies show that students, when they're taking final exams, tell the professor what that professor wants to hear for fear of getting a bad grade. So your friend, while laudable, is the exception and not the rule. And in higher education, that's really a shame.
Well, and of course, I saw your hand, Rick, and I've you got to get ready to get Coco show going as well. But and I kind of alluded to it. We keep saying that the campuses are very liberal, but I just know for a fact that even I'm literally can step outside and throw a rock at Duke's campus and everything, that there are both conservatives and liberals on any of those campuses. So I know that we oftentimes are painting these schools as being overly liberal when I know for a fact that there are some conservative organizations out there as well. So how can we say that a school is 100% liberal even when speakers come? Because I've seen speakers that have come that have been very what some people would say reactionary, maybe even borderline on fascist. And I've seen some that maybe are just as reactionary and maybe even bordering on socialism and communism that have come to various universities. Sometimes they are protested, sometimes they are not protested, but they are coming onto the campus because it comes down to what you just said. Universities are supposed to be a like a place where they get to get a variety of ideas and not just one opinion or another. It's supposed to be a place that you get to hear a variety of opinions. I know when I was at Marquette in the early 80s, there were people connected. We talked about Watergate. They were connected with the Watergate trial. And there were some folks that were glad to have Errol come to the campus. There were others that were not that thrilled to see him come to the campus and everything. But it's what the nature of the colleges are.
So I get a little annoyed when we talk about stuff when there are easy ways to establish what the deal is. The liberals say Trump has dementia. Conservatives say Biden has dementia. There's an easy way to take the words they say, compare them to the words 10 years ago, and there are tests to see if somebody's mental faculties are significantly declining. Nobody's done that. We just continue. And with the students are getting radicalized by their professors. You have thousands of protesters. If you count all the people across all the campuses, somebody should ask like a bunch of these protesters, where did you get the knowledge that led you to come here and protest? And
they got that knowledge from liberal professors across academia who allow one point of view in their classroom. Look at the percentages of liberal professors in academia, over 90%, particularly at Ivy League schools. You think students are going into a psychology, a sociology, a criminal justice, an English, a history course, and getting multiple perspectives? No, they are not. They're getting one perspective.
I don't think they but ask the...
That leads to ignorance.
Hold on. All you have to do is survey the students. Go, do you talk about this in classes? And did you get the knowledge? And where did you learn the stuff you learned? From a friend, from the media, from a professor? And we could find out,
And they're going to say from a professor, and that's why students...
But you don't have a factual basis.
Yes, I do. I have empirical data to support it, where students say when they answer questions on final exams, they tell the professor what they want to hear for fear of getting a bad grade. And that's because professors are indoctrinating rather than educating. And in so doing, they're promulgating ignorance rather than intellectualism.
Yeah, but if you're taking a class in South American Lit and you need to I doubt that you're spending a lot of time talking about Gaza.
Well, let me just Adam, just really quickly, because I went, like I said, I'm going to date myself once again, but when I was in
Rick, you should be a professor because you'd be a damn good one, I'll tell you.
No, I'm a terrible teacher. I got
but just really quickly for both of you, because when I was in college in the 80s and everything, I was at a college that has got some definite theological background. I mean, as I've told y'all before, as far as I'm concerned, I had a minor in theology, because if you go to a Jesuit university, you're going to have to take a certain amount of courses. But I can tell you that one of my best professors in those theology courses, one was very super liberal. I mean, he was part of what some people would call liberation theology and all along those lines. Another was very conservative. He was the gentleman that actually got me into reading the book, The Screwtape Letters, which is by C.S. Lewis, and all along those lines. So I had professors that were on both sides of the spectrum, and I would argue that most of that's what college kids are doing. And I think it might have been even Jacoby on one of our other shows mentioned it, and I know I've mentioned it before. Yeah, there are college kids that get involved in some of these protests because it is the quote unquote hip thing to do. And yes, to your point, Sasha, there are people that are probably debating because they have nothing better to do, and they are seeing it as a way, and Rick will love this, to have their pickup moments as well. So yeah, there are people that are doing things on that space.
That's why I would be there. I would.
So Mark, let's assume you're in a theology class at UCLA, and a question is raised: is God a feminist? Now, I will tell you what most professors would say. They would say, yes, God is a feminist, and they would exclude any other views that were contrary to that, and thereby they would degrade, demean, and denigrate the educational mission, which is to make students enlightened and inform them to have opinions for themselves. That's the problem with higher education, and these protests are a symptom of that problem, and they also are a harbinger of a future that is going to be anti-intellectualism, anti-enlightenment, and full of ignorance and ignominy, and that is the problem with this country and the biggest threat to democracy.
We had
Just
and you're a lot younger than I am, but everybody else here grew up during the Vietnam protests. Huge protests shut down campuses across the country.
Mhm.
And back then, we didn't have good information sources. We had, national news on 3 channels, half an hour a day. We had no, our phones were on the walls and you had to use a dial to use them. We had newspapers. Yeah, we had and we had Time and Newsweek magazine. And then we had our friends and, whatever, and we hated whatever the parents said. So we had terrible knowledge. Now everybody has endless knowledge should they decide to get off their phones and so I don't think we're getting more ignorant. I think we might be everybody in our own bubbles, but
No, we definitely are in our bubbles and everything. Hey, Rick and Adam and even Sasha, I was actually earlier today talking to a friend of mine because he is in the same space that I belong to, which is event planning, that particular space and all along those lines. So he had for years done a particular festival that was very environmentally friendly and still is environmentally friendly, the Eno Festival that I have emceed at probably for multiple decades and all along those lines. But he had some internal politics because politics happens in jobs as well. So he decided to they decided to let him go. He decided to be let go, and now they're trying to scramble and everything. But he is applying for a job because he told me that earlier today, and he might be running the events for the North Carolina convention of the Democrats. So if you knew somebody that was going to be running these conventions, whether it's on a local level, like the North Carolina one, that my friend Greg may be running it and everything, or being a part of the leadership team, or even the one that'll be coming to Chicago, I believe that's the Republicans, or the one that'll be coming to Milwaukee. I find that, and I've said this before on this show, slightly ironic because Milwaukee, which is where Marquette is, that's the college that I went to and everything. I always never knew it to be a super conservative area. So the fact that the Republicans are choosing to go there, I find a little bewildering, just in my mind, based on what I know of Milwaukee and everything. But what advice would you give to folks?
What is that? What you're talking about? Is it information or a question? What is it?
The question is, what advice would you give to folks that are running these conventions?
Yeah.
Adam, any thoughts about people that are running these conventions? Because, there are going to be all kinds of protests. Speaking of protests, they're going to have to put that onto the plate as well. So what advice would you give to folks that are running?
In a very old interview to Playboy, Steve Martin was asked, what would you advise a young beginner comedian? And you know what he said? Always take your wallet on stage.
Rick?
I have advice for the Democrats. They ill-advisedly are having their national convention in Chicago, and they need to come up with a plan for dealing with massive protests, because Chicago, 1968, Vietnam War protests, Democratic national conventions, Chicago PD beating the crap out of protesters, a terrible look, contributed to the Democrats losing the presidential election. So you could see a repeat of that scenario. Cops beating up protesters, then Fox News saying it's democratic chaos. If you want law and order, then vote for us.
Well, Mark, when it comes to conventions, what I would say is this: implement time, place, and manner restrictions. Push these protesters to the side. Let them express their views, but the First Amendment allows you to implement time, place, and manner restrictions so that they won't be a distraction. But ultimately, this discussion comes down to one example I'll give you. Imagine being in a classroom and you have 3 students. One student comes in with a shirt that says, "Make America Great Again." A second student comes in with a shirt that says, "All Black people deserve reparations." A third student comes in with a shirt that says the coronavirus is a scam. Which one of those 3 would you exclude from the classroom? My argument would be none of them. That you have to allow offensive and uncomfortable speech if you are going to educate people, because you have to learn how to be uncomfortable if you are going to acquire knowledge. Our higher educations our institutions of higher education aren't doing that. It's a shame, and that's why you see the degradation in intellectualism in this country, and it's playing out through these protests at places like Columbia.
I think people are largely free to express their opinion. I mean, okay, so there's demographic pressure. But there's the and yeah, most people on college campuses are liberal, but that doesn't mean that you're prevented or kicked out of class for expressing views that.
Oh, yes, you are. Yes, you are. You're marginalized if you express conservative views, and I'm not even a conservative.
I don't know. When I was a conservative protester in college, just to freak people out, my frat, I belonged to a frat, and there was we had a nuclear bomb factory 10 miles out of town in Golden, and there was an anti-nuke protest, and my frat buddies and I decided, hey, let's just go be assholes for no good reason. And so we showed up there with to protest more nukes, less kooks. We had containers, what we said were plutonium, and we spilled plutonium all over the place. And people were very annoyed, but it was just to be jerks.
Funny.
And that's your right. And every conservative and liberal should have that right too. It's sad that they don't on our campuses today.
Plus, I've worked on campuses for 20 years after I, did a terrible job as a student. And I used to pose for art classes, and I never heard any politics. And I mean, that's not where you'd expect to hear politics.
Well, you know why I think you didn't do well? Because the discussion was not on your level. And I think that's part of the problem.
It's because I worked in bars till 2:30 in the morning, and if I had an 8 a.m. class, I'd sleep through it.
I have a feeling if you were intellectually stimulated, you would have been at that 8 a.m. class. I sense that you weren't.
Because on top, and I was lazy, so like it wasn't. Anyway, not about me. It's about
you've accomplished a great deal, so you should be proud of yourself.
I wrote a bunch of dumb jokes for TV. But thank you.
Brilliant jokes, you mean?
I only came up with one. Well, I had some brilliant bits, but you're not supposed to talk. If you work on those shows, you're not supposed to go around talking about which bits were yours.
Which bits worked?
They belong to the show. It's a
understood.
Okay.
I just hope that the audience understands what the purpose of this discussion is that if you're going to have a democracy, you have to have equality. And to have equality, you have to have liberty. Liberty requires people believing and being able to express all viewpoints regardless of fear of cancel culture, wokeism, or government recrimination. We're going in the wrong direction. Unless we right that direction, we will not make America great ever.
So I have a question for you. Do you think the arguments, now I can't watch Fox because I'm a liberal. I can't watch Fox News for very long before I get pissed off and change the channel.
I'm sorry.
But do you find that the arguments presented on Fox News and also on CNN and MSNBC are good arguments, or is it a bunch of like glib, easy crap?
No, I think the arguments presented on Fox are partisan and biased. I think the arguments presented on MSNBC are pathetic and biased. I think the same of CNN. My claim is not that a particular station or organization is to blame. It's that they are all to blame, conservative or liberal. And you know what? They do a terrible disservice to the American people while lining their pockets with millions of dollars and contributing to the ignorance, the prejudice, and the partisanship that is a cancer on our democracy, and that will metastasize in the 2024 election if we don't stop it.
Adam,
I agree with that.
In liberal programs like CNN and MSNBC and Republican fake news, what's this, Fox News?
Fox News?
Okay, here's the difference. The liberal programs, they call fake electors. And the conservative medium, they call them alternative electors. That's the only one difference. All the other thing is very similar. This is a very, very big difference.
Right, and MSNBC
I had a conversation with somebody who listens only to conservative media. And when I said fake electors, he asked me, what is it? I said, you never heard what is fake electors? No. Oh, then I started to explain. He said, "Oh, it's alternative electors, it's not fake electors." So I understand the difference now.
Fair enough.
But just really quickly, because it's time for us to wrap up and get ready to do Coco show and everything. To your point that you asked me earlier, Sasha, and I would argue this even with presidents, and I think Adam would agree with me on this. Yeah, you become an expert on anything, whether it's reparations or whether it's you being a former president, then yeah, you get to go on these consulting trips. I think that the reason he was, my cousin was taken down, I think he's second and everything to California is because there's been conversations in that particular legislation around the reparations issue. So yeah, you become a consultant, whether you're a president or whether you have a passion interest, whatever that passion interest is. And there are people on both the conservative and the liberal side that have those jobs.
How much these people charge an hour, a month?
Oh, they get charged. I can tell you that I did a walking tour on Monday. I did not make that money, but I looked at the lady that organized it because she was doing a destination trip. So she was taking people to Ecuador so they could get the experience of Ecuador from Ecuadorians. She was taking them to Durham and Asheville and Durham have this Black Wall Street space and everything. And when I looked at the charges, these women that were coming on these trips were, this is minus hotel and minus everything else. They were making between, I think, $1,200 to $1,500, and they were like 15 women. So that was a quick $30,000 that Kiona, who is a doctor from Hawaii, made just on that one trip and everything. So yeah, they're making pretty good money. And to answer your question, for one-stop trips and one-stop consultations.
Good. I can suggest next destination, Gaza. How about that?
Well, I don't think, unless they're going to get some Gaza people to come and do the trip, I will see if Kelna wants to take some people to Gaza and get that Gaza trip. Maybe Adam can lead it with them.
Will do. On my way to Moscow.
All right. On your way to Moscow, because I know you're going to do the Moscow trip as well. And on that note, we're going to get on out of here. But definitely, this has been a lively discussion, and we'll have another one on Tuesday, but we'll have World Edition tomorrow. But definitely appreciate
Nice seeing you all. Thank you.
I hope to see you back in 2029. Okay.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.